Thank you for joining us today for this session where we'll be looking at succession planning. We're pleased to see numbers going up as I speak. While we're waiting for more to join, I'll cover some housekeeping points. Thanks. The session is being recorded and we'll share handouts, slides and a link after the event. We're also putting a link to the succession planning document into the chat once we start so that you'll be able to download it straight away. This event is CPD accredited. If you would like a certificate, please give your consent to share your data in the survey that will pop up as you leave the session. If you have any questions about the session, we really hope that you do have some to share. Please post them into the Q&A function and we'll endeavour to get to as many of them as possible. Finally, we'd like to thank the Institute of Engineering and Technology for sponsoring today and yesterday. We're delighted to have their support for the event. I think numbers look to have stabilised a little bit. So without further ado, my name is Hannah Stolten and I am the Chief Executive here at Governors for Schools. Welcome to this 30-minute workshop where we're delighted to be joined by Steve Edmonds, who will be sharing thoughts on succession planning for your board. This is a topic that we've been asked about in a couple of earlier sessions, so we're really delighted to have it on the agenda today. If you do have questions, as I said during the session, please post them via the Q&A function. We'll try to get to as many as possible, but if there's any we don't get to, we'll share responses afterwards. Steve is Director of Advice and Guidance at the National Governance Association and recently published the report, Finding Your Next Chair, a Succession Planning Guide, which we were delighted to collaborate on. And I think Ashley's just putting it into the chat now. So welcome, Steve. Thanks ever so much for joining us. And I'm going to hand over to you straight away.
Thank you so much, Hannah. Good morning, everyone. And it's lovely to be with you and to be part of this excellent conference. So without further ado, I think we should get underway with our first slide, please, if we don't mind moving on. And I won't spend too much time on this slide because I'm sure that you're all aware of NGA as an organisation, who we are, and what we offer. So all I would add is that it's an absolute privilege and indeed a big responsibility to be in a role that supports those who govern in our schools and trusts, and indeed to be part of an organisation that works to strengthen the system of school governance so that it is the best that it can be for our children and young people. And I know that's an aim that you all share too. So let's move on to our next slide, because fundamental towards making the system of school governance the best that it can be is, of course, having enough volunteers in the system to serve on our school governing boards. It's fundamental that we have boards with a mix, the right mix and balance of membership, experienced and new members, all of whom are connected to the communities that they serve. And it's fundamental that we have boards that are well led and that there is continuity of leadership. And that means identifying and developing individuals to step into a chairing role or a vice chairing role when the time is right and when the time comes. And that's going to be the focus of our conversation this morning. NGA thinks very deeply about these issues. Our thought leadership leads us to reporting on how to increase participation in school and trust governance, and also turning some of that thought leadership into practical guidance which you can apply at board level to go about achieving it in your own context. So time forbids me from sort of spending too much time talking about what's in the guidance, but please do, if you're a member of NGA, look at that content, and because I think it will be highly useful contextualizing what you were doing at board level. And what I don't want to do is downplay here the challenge of recruitment and diversifying governing boards and leadership continuity. Our annual survey data recently published does show that the number of vacancies on governing boards are higher than at any time since we started recording them this way in 2016. The percentage of governors and trustees below the age of 40 is the lowest that we've seen on record, which is an issue in terms of that pipeline of succession and continuity that I was talking about. Indeed, more than half of the volunteers who govern in our schools and trusts are now over the age of 60, and we know that governors and trustees are serving longer, indeed, typically for more than 8 years, which is the equivalent, as you know, of 2 terms of office. So it's not easy bringing new people into the system and then developing them to lead boards in the future. I appreciate that. I also appreciate that the diversification of governing boards, both in terms of age and reflecting the communities we serve, is also a challenge as well. Our data tells us that only 4% of those leading governing boards are from a minority ethnic background, which would suggest that board leadership is perhaps not reflective of many of the communities that those boards are serving. But it's worth also knowing that same survey data indicates that 43% of those from ethnic minority communities who responded to our survey have indicated that they would consider leading their governing board and taking on a board leadership role. So there are grounds for encouragement there, and I think this is a really important issue, and I'm going to address this up front and say that clearly I'm from a group that's perhaps overrepresented in school governance right now, and we do need to address that issue, and we all have that collective responsibility. But on the flip side, there's a real opportunity and grounds for optimism. We have data and evidence which shows that boards that are proactive when it comes to recruitment and succession planning do tend to be successful. So I'd really like you to hang on to that throughout this workshop, and I hope that you'll use it as protected thinking time to reflect on where your board is at in terms of recruitment and succession planning, how proactive you are, and start to build your own plan of action and engage the people you need to support you, whether that's inside or outside of your board. And if we could just move on quickly to the next slide, please, because Hannah mentioned that we just published alongside Governance for Schools and Inspiring Governance, a guide to succession planning and how boards can go about that strategically and in a very practical way. And we very much encourage you to use that guide as an aid memoir, if you like, as a high-level aid memoir to creating your own plan and embedding your own culture of succession planning, thinking about the way you go about electing and appointing your chair every year, how you can actually make that an issue throughout the year in terms of discussion and planning, engage those activities that are proven to work, and build the leadership capacity on your governing board, so when the time comes, you're in a great position to ensure that continuity of leadership. So please do take a look at that guide and use that to inform your own thinking. So before I go on to talk a bit more about what's in that guide, I'd like to bring you in and gain a sense of your leadership and succession planning context. And I'm going to do that by conducting 2 very quick polls. The first of which is the first question of which is, how long has your chair of your governing board been in office? I can see the answers coming up there already, and I'm just going to give a few more seconds to close that poll. Let's say 3, 2, 1, and we'll close that poll now. So I'm seeing that imagine majority of you have a chair who's been in office for between 1 and 6 years, which is the recommended period of good practice, really, that a chair should serve for no more than 6 years in office, and then 17%, so just around approaching a quarter have had a chair in office for longer than that, and a small proportion more than a decade, which is actually bucking the trend of our national data slightly, because our data shows that now that we have approaching 25% of chairs of governing boards in our schools that have been in charge for more than 10 years, which I think, whatever the context and the reasons are for that, is probably not, you would agree, an entirely healthy situation, especially if that person who has been leading for a long time is reluctant to be in charge, but doesn't feel there's any other opportunity an option other than letting the school down or putting them at risk. So if we don't mind moving on to our second poll, please, because now I have an indication of the audience I'm talking to. I just would like to get an indication of where we are in terms of does your board actually have a succession plan, or is this an a live conversation on your governing board? So if we could just open that poll, please, and just get a simple yes or no to that. Does your board discuss and have a plan for who your next chair will be? Do you have that in mind? So I'm just seeing the answers coming up now. It's very brief. We'll just conduct that. Let's close that in 3, 2, 1. And what an interesting contrast there. Maybe not entirely surprising. The overwhelming majority of you are not actively considering succession planning, and perhaps that has something to do with the fact that your chairs haven't been in office as long as those we've seen with our national data, but succession planning is an issue for all times. So let's see if as a result of this workshop we can at least boost the profile of succession planning in terms of your own governing board, and start to create some planning and some strategy for who your next chair is going to be, because you're all there, all of you. I don't know your individual context, of course, but you're all on a spectrum of risk, if you like, in terms of leadership and leadership continuity, and because failing to succession plan, or not having a plan of succession, or having that leadership continuity, does bring with it some risk. And we'll just move on to the next slide, and we'll, if that's okay, just because I'm sure you're acutely aware of the risks to having no succession to the chair, and we've seen this. We've seen the impact on governance of abrupt departures from the chair's position, or indeed that situation where there is just no one to step in and lead the board. That does have an impact on board effectiveness, because you don't have that leadership capacity, you don't have that figurehead, and so much of what we're required to do as governing boards in terms of demonstrating compliance is focused on the chair, as the leader, as the figurehead of the board. And so having those things uncoordinated is a very powerful negative statement about the effectiveness and the capacity of governance. It's also highly unsettling. It has an effect on board dynamics and culture. It affects behaviours amongst and operating routines amongst the other members of the governing boards. It also doesn't do a great deal for morale and relationships, particularly of school leaders not having that really important sounding board or person who is ensuring that the board is strategically focused. And of course, the outside perception of the organisation is going to take a hit if it's known that it's rudderless at that strategic level. The stakeholder confidence can easily ebb away, and as can the confidence in leadership and management. So a scenario whereby your chair is not your chair's position is not secure, even if there is somebody in post right now, you're not quite sure what's going to happen in the immediate future, does bring with it some significant risk, as I'm sure you all know. So it's most important that we hardwire this into our conversations about school, about governance and governance effectiveness, alongside the other things we do to measure that. So the first, if we don't mind moving on to the next slide, I think the first fundamental thing that we can all do to reduce the risk of succession planning, or not having a successor, is to make the issue visible, and ensure that discussion about succession planning and activity is all year round, rather than just a reaction to a vacancy occurring. And for that to happen, you need clarity and openness. So if any of you are there in this audience, I'm sure you are, I'm talking to a lot of chairs, That really starts with you openly reflecting on your own plans and intentions, medium to long term, in terms of how long you see yourself in the role, or how long you think it's healthy to continue in the role. Because if you actually set that tone, then that starts the conversation naturally, really, or at least it should do. And from that conversation starting point, we then start to generate our ideas and our thoughts upon what talent we have on the board or outside of the board, current and potential governors, with the confidence and the capacity to take on the role immediately or within the next 12 months, say, for example. Starting to get them used to the idea and perhaps gaining their initial commitment to take it on, to clear the decks to do that, to get the support and the development that they need to take over, or at least put themselves forward to take over when the time comes, and then building the capacity behind that, whether that's identifying what those specific development needs are, both for them and the board that will be supporting them, bringing that support in, and sharing that learning. Now, those things happen throughout the year. They don't have to happen in a particular sequence or a particular order, but what that cycle of succession planning is conveying there is just the importance of hardwiring these conversations into your governing thinking, and to ensure that this issue has a profile and it is discussed in a tangible way. And that brings me on to the next slide, if we may, if we can change slides there, onto talking about some of the succession planning activities that work and that are proven to work, and we've seen this. We've got evidence of this. We speak to governing boards, we conduct surveys, and they tell us that when it comes to finding their next or future leaders of the governing boards, that when they focus on these things, conversations, strategic and targeted, recruitment, their recruitment strategy, building the team they have, and building the team of leaders, when they focus on those things, they are more likely to be successful and less likely to be in trouble when it comes to leadership continuity, and finding their next chair. So if we can just touch on a few of those in a little bit more detail. I'm going to start with conversations. If we don't move me on to the next slide, please, because conversations are really what governance is all about. The quality of our engagement with each other, the quality of our debate, is what makes governance what it is and what we want it to be on behalf of our children and young people. And when we're talking about conversations about succession, there's really two broad categories: the strategic conversations, which I mentioned a few moments ago, that take place throughout the year, where we start to think about how we're going to ensure leadership continuity, those strategic board level conversations which lead to action. But what I'd like to focus on are those really targeted, issue-driven conversations with individuals. So we have an idea of what we want to do. We have a sense that we have some talent on the governing board who we want to really develop. What's going to make that happen? Do we need to talk to them about misconceptions about the role? What's involved? Is there somebody on the governing board who is an obvious successor or a strong candidate, but wouldn't put themselves forward? They think the current chair is indispensable, or that role can only be undertaken by that person doing it the way they do it. It's the role. Let's start to change that perception. What role can you do within your own context? Let's break that down. How can we distribute leadership that's in a different way to make that manageable for that person in their context? What else might be putting them off? Do they perceive the board as being challenging to lead? Do they think the relationship between the current chair and the school leader is so exclusive that it will be very difficult to replicate, or be as successful in replicating if they were to do it? Well, let's see if we can unpick those issues. How do we build people's confidence so that they see them as a leader? Does is there a particular piece of development? Is there some shadowing? Is there some peer support and networking that you could maybe through local governance networks, or through, if you're in a multi-academy trust, through engagement with local governance in a particular way, or just through good old-fashioned CPD or targeted support that's going to make that happen. So conversations run through all of this, and they are key to success. As is recruitment. Your strategy for recruiting governance. If we don't mind moving on to the next slide, please. I think this is really important, because when we think about recruitment and targeted recruitment of governors individuals, you'll have all sorts of approaches that you'll take. You'll be using your school website and social media, no doubt. You'll be using your parent body. You'll be using local employers, your alumni. You'll be volunteering services like Governors for Schools and word of mouth. You'll all have your own distinct strategic approach towards recruiting governors and trustees. Well, actually, it's just it's a case of taking that a stage further and thinking ahead in terms of what do you really need to prioritize through recruitment? Is it recruiting individuals with experience of chairing meetings and leading a team? Is it are there people in your community, whether they're in neighbourhood forums, faith groups, other agencies that you work with, whom you could approach to bring talent in who you could see in a future leadership role? I actually think that targeted recruitment of governors and trustees is an excellent barometer of how well and how connected a board is to the community it serves. So think about how you, through your current recruitment strategies, you might increase your options for leadership. That's a very strong theme in the guide. I'm going to move on now because I'm conscious of the time, and I'm hoping somebody will give me a time check in a few moments. Building an effective and engaged team. It follows, of course, and the guide's very clear about this, that people are more likely to want to lead a team that is effective and engaged than one that is less functional or dare I say dysfunctional. So the quality of relationships that exist between governors and trustees and leaderships really does impact on how people's perceptions are about wanting to lead it in the future, but also is the sharing of the workload as well. If there is if you have a governing board which is effectively led, but it's quite clear that 1, 2, or 3 people do all the work in terms of whether it's engagement with the community, whether it's leading task and finish groups, or engagement with the local authority or committees or whatever it might be, that it becomes a more daunting prospect then, I think, for someone to step into that role and think, actually, by leading this board, I'm going to be taking on even more responsibility, and perhaps more than I can manage alongside my professional and family commitments. So thinking about how work is distributed is a really important part of this, as is high quality governance professional support. And I'm not just talking about advice on rules and regulations. I'm talking about a professional advisor you can lean on, somebody who can help coordinate your CPD activity or give you advice strategically about how the board's manages its business throughout the year in a way that is manageable and then lends itself to greater participation, which therefore enhances the chances of leadership. And CPD and assessing development, that absolutely starts with induction. So bringing people in, inducting them properly, and setting the tone for what's expected of them as a board member, both in terms of contribution and their own development and a level of understanding of what they are governing, is vital. So these things are all go hand in hand, and our evidence is that when boards think about these things rather than react to these things, then they're much more likely to have good continuity of leadership and a clear plan. I'm going to move on quickly. I am conscious of the time, so if we can just move on to the next slide, because this is a nice a nice link to what I've just been talking about, which is building that team of leaders and increasing leadership capacity. Now, this is interesting because this is an area that we see from evidence is perhaps underexploited. We thought at one point that co-chairing as a concept would increase. We thought that would develop. We thought we'd see more co-chairs. It is possible to share the role of chair. It may indeed prove to be a useful option, especially where individuals have the skills but not the time. But often it's thought, well, actually, that's not possible. It has to be one board, one leader. I can't see that working with two people. Where are the lines of responsibility? How does that not become confused? Well, actually, it is possible, and we've seen it work really well. And actually, we've got some guidance on making a co-chairing arrangement work, which is, has been robustly tested. And I know I'd recommend that you have a read, and that may change your perception on that. Of course, raising a profile of the vice chair is one way we can do that. So that's less of a sort of standing role for somebody if the chair's absent. Let's make that more of a substantial role, and actually perhaps look at it as an apprenticeship for the role of chair by giving some distributed leadership responsibility, whether that's as a first point of contact, whether that's for complaints or other issues, coordinating induction of board members, or looking at the skills and capacity of the governing board, giving dedicated responsibilities to that role rather than seeing it as a standing position, does help increase leadership capacity. But there's lots more you can do to create a team of leaders, encouraging members of boards to volunteer and shadow and mentor more experienced governors, volunteer to serve on committees, providing opportunities to observe and participate in chairing activities does help provide the level of insight and bring the role, maybe remove some of the mystique around the role or the mystery around the role, and make it a more viable and meaningful opportunity that people perhaps want to grasp as part of their own personal development and indeed professional development. So there's a lot of things that we can do that perhaps we don't think, we don't perhaps spend enough time thinking about. We perhaps focus on the issue of getting governors in the first place and almost write off some of these strategies which are proven to work, and that's a great shame. So what I'm going to do now is, if we don't mind moving on please to our next slide, is just see if I've, been that very quick rattle through, if I've changed any of your perceptions there. And I just want a quick reaction really to some of those things I've talked about. And from your own context, which do you think from your own position right now will make the most, should be the main priority for your governing board? I'm just watching these. I'm going to go 3, 2, 1. We'll stop the clock, and let's see. So that's really interesting. So there's not one, dominant activity there. I hopefully it just shows that context really matters here. You've all got your own governing experiences. You've all got your own board context, and you'll all be somewhere in this, to use that dreadful phrase, journey of governance development and succession planning. And so it's no surprise really that you'll have a different, a range of views on which of these activities are most important to you right now. Of course, they're all important to you. I've asked you to prioritize one, which is perhaps a little bit unfair. But it's good to see that not one of these strategies, perhaps team building, but that's perhaps a little bit more generic, I'd understand that. Not one of these activities has been written off entirely by the whole audience, which is really reassuring to see. And it's a good note for me to end on, if we don't mind moving to the next slide, and say that hopefully I've sort of, in a short time I've had with you, triggered some ideas, triggered some thoughts, and really given you at least an incentive to check out the guide and the other information we have on recruiting and diversifying governing boards, and not write the solutions off before you've given them chance to breathe. I know it's tough out there. I know what the challenges are, but I think we've also seen that those boards who are proactive can make a real difference to their effectiveness, and indeed, by extension, what they do for their children and young people, which is what we're all about. So that's it from me. Thank you for all you do, and thank you for this opportunity to talk to you about succession planning.
Thank you ever so much, Steve. That was really, really interesting. And we are dead on 10:45. One question that we've had is there a place for a chair to stay on the governing board after their term has finished, or would you expect them to move to another board?
Right. Well, that's a really good question. We really, as an organisation, as policy, and it's proven practice, in good practice in other sectors, our vision is that that chairs do serve for no more than 6 years, and then do move around the system, because we think obviously that will strengthen governance, and that that improves outcomes for children. But of course, context matters here. It's no point making that an edict. Every school and board will have its own context, and sometimes it might actually be a greater risk, or to that board and to that school or trust, if you were to just impose arbitrary time limits. So it has to, we have to trust our boards to make those judgments. But I think what we shouldn't do is fall into the trap of thinking that it's okay for somebody to go on and on and on just because we can't see a different alternative. That's not healthy.
Thank you ever so much. There were lots of comments in the chat, I know, around getting people to step forward in the first place. I know some of that is covered in the report, and we will respond to those questions in our follow-up document. Thank you ever so much to everybody for joining us today. It's been a pleasure to have you here, and I hope that you will continue to enjoy the conference over the rest of the day. Thanks to Steve for his insightful knowledge and an understanding of the situation with succession planning. Hope everybody's enjoyed it, and look forward to seeing you in our next session. Thank you. Goodbye.